And sorry, ladies and gentlemen, so the next speaker will be the Honorable Anthony Hilton, Minister from Jamaica. Sorry, sir.
Colleague ministers, the Secretary General, if he's here, I have not seen him, the Executive Director of Caribbean Exports, members of the Caribbean private business and academic sectors, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is always good to take stock of where you are and the progress you have made with the actions that you have planned. It is 20 years since the West Indian Commission produced its landmark report, Time for Action, and Caribbean heads of government endorsed its recommendations. I wish at the outset to thank Caribbean Export for bringing us together to review our performance in terms of the implementation of the specific recommendations and the responses of our economies. In this session, we are charged with making an analysis of the region's performance or response to the recommendations through its export trade, which is real and historical performance. It is my judgment, however, that if our frame of reference is history, we will end up in lamentations. The region is in deep crisis. It's a deep and complex crisis. We really don't need the statistics to tell us that. Our mindset must therefore be how to get out, recover any lost ground, and to move forward. My question to us, therefore, is what action? Those recommended from the situation, the regional and global of 1992, or the situation of 2013. I'm convinced that even if we had implemented all the recommendations of 1992, we would still have been in difficulty today. To be sure, we would have had a better and firmer platform from which to fight, but we would have had to be fighting. Why do I say this? We did implement the recommendations for the establishment of an Association of Caribbean States. That was achieved in August 1994. A major objective was to position us as a wider Caribbean grouping, 34 states strong, in our economic and especially our trade relations with North America and the rest of the world. But by December 1994, the following occurred. Mexico, a leading member of the grouping, had joined up with Canada and the United States of America to create NAFTA. Mexico actually left the ranks of developing countries to join the OECD. 33 of the 34 members of the ACS had agreed with Canada and the United States to create a free trade area of the Americas, the FTAA, within a short time frame. All negotiating resources were diverted to that enterprise. Almost all the members of the ACS had signed on to the World Trade Organization, which was to become operational on 1st of January 1995. The agreement establishing the WTO, as we all know, instituted new rules and disciplines for free trade agreements requiring reciprocity in a situation where an underlying objective of the ACS was to create an asymmetrical and graduated arrangement to be used as a model in negotiating trade agreements with larger and more developed countries. The ACS was essentially stillborn at birth, even though we have found other useful functions for it. I have drawn attention to these facts to suggest that we might be more productive if we use this opportunity to analyze where we are as a region economically and socially in the global environment of 2013, to identify or begin to identify the resources and attributes the region possesses to help to address its challenges, and suggest strategies and actions which should be deployed with the urgency and the resources required by a crisis. In that context, I will leave the detailed statistical analyses of the performance of the Caribbean and the individual states under the global and other trade agreements to the technical experts to come. I will, on the basis of my layman's understanding of the statistics and trends, and more so global politics, trends and directions, suggest a few urgent lines of action for us as a region of small states in a competitive and non-sympathetic global environment. First, there is a fundamental shift in the geographic direction and location of global economic production, wealth or demand, and trade. This long wave, or what some sometimes call the Kondratief wave, was in ferment in 1992, but is now in full bloom. The center of global economic activity, accumulation and consumption was squarely in Western Europe from the first Industrial Revolution to World War II, and then shifted to North America after the war, has now shifted again to the East, as in Asia, and more generically, the South. North America and Western Europe are in crisis, and some would say decline. They are in protective and defensive mode. Asia and some countries in Africa and South America are in growth, even when constrained by the Western economic crisis. They are the new source of demand for inputs, natural resources, and of finished goods. It is critical to note, however, that in this economic wave, production has met surplus labor and significantly unmet demand. The opportunities which were in the Western Europe and North American wave for migrant, unskilled, and semi-skilled labor are likely to be very weak in this wave. In the early phase, there is more likely to be the tendency for outward migration with any capital or technical assistance export. The Caribbean's economic and trade infrastructure, including trade agreements and investments, and more critically, its diaspora and mindset are North America and Western Europe focused. This is a challenge which must be addressed through urgent and strategically targeted actions and alliances. Second, and here the historical statistics are important in assisting our understanding of trends and directions. The Caribbean has been losing its global ranking or market share in almost every area since 1990. To illustrate, its share of world GDP, which was just under 0.10% in 1990, while relatively stable, has been with a tendency to decline. World exports, which was at 0.10% in 1990, has fallen to 0.5% in 2008. World service export, which was close to 0.5% in 1990, has fallen to less than 0.3% in 2008. And world tourism from 1.2% in 1990 to under 0.8% in 2008. It is worthy of note that most of the decline has been since the mid-1990s, when Caribbean countries joined the WTO and began to liberalize the import trade regimes, even as they lost preferences in developed country markets as new trade rules were applied. It is also worth noting that even where the Caribbean has trade agreement with developed countries such as the members of the European Union under the Cotonou and the successor EPA, horizontal and discretionary measures such as visa requirements and graduation vitiate their potential positive impacts. The discriminatory air passenger tax by the United Kingdom is perhaps the most notorious. But I'll express a personal view here, which is that notwithstanding the reservation that some of us had, and I certainly had my own reservation to the conclusion of the EPA as and when it did, I believe that 5 years after the signing, that it is high time that the Caribbean begin to focus on exploitation, implementation and exploitation of the EPA agreement. And I think the time for the debate has long passed. Third, the anti-terrorist measures and the increasing security requirements, anti-drug and anti-money laundering acts since 2001, necessary as they are, have placed disproportionate strain on small Caribbean economies simply because of their location and easy accessibility. Some of these security measures, including food safety requirements, are thinly disguised non-tariff barriers. The global economic recession, which became manifest in 2008, and the anti-recessionary measures deployed have been particularly challenging for Caribbean countries with no capacity to provide stimulus to their economic agents. It should not be forgotten that most of the Caribbean countries operated with positive, even if small, fiscal balances up to 2007. The challenges are a reality, however. The external environment is increasingly hostile. Note the unilateral decision of the EU to graduate Caribbean countries from the resources under the new agreements, in spite of the philosophy embodied in the 4 Lomé Conventions and the Cotonou Agreement relating to the provisions of development assistance. Note also the decisions of international and bilateral bodies to graduate the region from concessionary resources for critical programs such as HIV/AIDS. The Caribbean must therefore look at its resources or attributes and strategize how to most effectively deploy them. I suggest 4 clusters of assets, not in any priority order. 1, that 45 years of cooperation and integration experience with an array of institutions in a new world discovering the virtues of cooperation to moderate competition. 2, culture and creativity. 3, strategic natural resources. And 4, the Caribbean Sea. Let me treat with them briefly. In July of this year, CARICOM will celebrate 40 years of broad-based integration and cooperation. This itself followed 5 years of very successful free trade arrangement through CARIFTA. There is an agreed treaty structure, the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas of 2001, which delineates areas of cooperation and integration and provides for an array of institutions, not only to foster developments, but also to regulate and adjudicate adherence, seek to avoid and finally settle any dispute. This is a wonderful bundle of assets. I just want to highlight its provisions for access to and joint development of our natural and human resources, as well as our not insignificant regional market as base for our entrepreneurs. This base is strength on which to practice and build capacity to access external markets competitively. The urgency of fully implementing the CSME, of playing and allowing others to play by the rules, and facilitating action is impatient of debate and discussion. The statistics and experience have convinced me that at least one of our members is not playing fully by the rules. Common sense economics would tell us that it is near impossible, with economic forces at work, for your economy to be growing, for your exports to your regional partners to be growing exponentially, and for your imports from third countries to be growing consistently, but your imports from your integration partners who are located near to you to be falling consistently. There has to be manipulation. Something is wrong with this picture. Jamaica is clear on at least one area, as discussed it for years with the partner state with which it enjoys good relations, and is now considering to take the matter further to the Caribbean Court of Justice in Port of Spain. On culture, creativity, and athleticism. The Caribbean has blended from the three continents from which its imported population hails, as well as from the original inhabitants who survived the capture of their lands and its proximity to North America, a unique and rich culture and a creativity which is the envy of many. Its athleticism is not in the food, but in the natural selection process through the Middle Passage, and the rigor of plantation slavery, and the natural terrain with the feet as the only chariot. Survival fell to the fittest, the most cunning and fastest thinking. We can debate the reasons, but these are attributes in abundance in a world which now craves such expressions. Just last week at Jamaica's National High School Track and Field Championship, some 30 championship records were broken, clearly indicating that there remains a healthy pipeline of talents sufficient to ensure the continued dominance of Jamaica and the Caribbean on the world track and field stage. The region has established itself in these areas for fun, while others have enjoyed and made fortunes from them. In 2012, the Caribbean celebrated 40 years of Carifesta, a periodic rendering of the range of creative expressions. 50 years of the iconic reggae music, 64 years of winning medals at the Olympics, and a much longer history of calypso, carnival, and the steel pan, the only musical instrument created in the 20th century. It is past time for action to turn these into stable economic products for global trade. We need agreements which will protect the rights of the creatives and facilitate their delivery of their products, including their personal expressions. The Caribbean has negotiated trade agreements in which it organizes its borders to facilitate the entry of physical goods from partners. Those agreements must now have provisions for the protection and facilitation of Caribbean service providers and rights holders. This again calls for urgent action. On strategic natural resources, the Caribbean area, because of its geographic spread, has significant natural resources: bauxite, oil and natural gas, rainforests, agricultural lands, unique and extensive biodiversity in fauna and flora, resources for alternative energy, water for hydro, OTEC, wave, the sun for solar, wind, biomass, and precious minerals. It is high time we begin to develop these resources in combination or singly. The revised Treaty of Chaguaramas anticipates and facilitates this. Leaders such as the President of Suriname have been proposing this. We need now for private, public, or joint public-private sector companies and entities to begin to convert into business. Let us remind ourselves that the revised treaty provides for the movement of the factors of production, including hassle-free movement of CARICOM nationals. Let me conclude now on the Caribbean Sea. The Caribbean Sea is one of our most extensive natural resources, and it touches, surrounds, in most cases, all Caribbean states. The 2012 UN Declaration, pioneered by the ACS, gives all states responsibility for its management in the context of sustainable development. It is now extensively used for cruise tourism and yachting. In each case, approximately 50% of global capacity operates in the Caribbean Sea. The contribution to regional development, especially of the first, is still to be established. The Caribbean Sea is also one of the most heavily used seas in international commerce. This is about to become much more so. The coincidence of the shift in the fulcrum of global economic activity, production and trade, from intra-North Atlantic, south, and to the Pacific, the deepening and widening of the Panama Canal, and development in shipbuilding technology to create supersized ships and tankers for dry and liquid cargo, including bulk cargo and passenger vessels, increases manifold the importance of the Caribbean Sea to international trade. The issue is whether the Caribbean will organize and take advantage or sit back and become victims to the potential pollution and possible accidents. Jamaica, with the seventh largest natural harbor in the world, and positioned directly in the entrance to and exit from the Panama Canal, has decided that it will not be victim. Jamaica has therefore decided to establish the fourth node in the global supply chain. The other three, of course, are Singapore, Dubai, and Rotterdam. These are complementary nodes, not competing nodes, in the global logistics and supply chain that underpins international trade. The Jamaican node, like the other three, are global assets. They open opportunities to and from the world. The Caribbean, with its relatively small volumes, would be at a competitive disadvantage in servicing distant markets in Asia, the Pacific region, including continents like Australia and Africa, will now be at an advantage with large ships, often with excess capacity directionally, can now be at the center of global trade. The only challenge will be to maintain effective linkage with the Port of Kingston. A similar opportunity still arises for cruise and land-based tourists arriving in the super cruise ships and aircraft. The global logistic hub will not only cater to ships, but to aircraft. The key elements of this initiative include: one, the dredging of the Kingston Harbor to accommodate the larger post-Panamax vessels; the expansion of the Kingston Container Terminal to accommodate the increased volume of traffic expected to result from the opening of the Panama Canal in April 2015; the development of a transshipment commodity port to position the country as a hub for global bulk cargo storage and shipments, supporting regional food and energy security; fourth, the establishment of dry dock facility to provide ship repairs and maintenance services; fifth, the development of the Vernon Field cargo and passenger facility to accommodate long-haul cargo and passenger flights, as well as supporting maintenance, repair, and overall services; and sixth, the development of the Caymanized Economic Zone to serve as a center for logistics and allied services. I have taken the time to describe both the vision and the opportunities in the logistic hub. Jamaica is aware that it cannot contain or monopolize a range of opportunities. Others in the international trading world recognize and are seeking to ride the Jamaican wave in much the same way as Jamaica is riding the Panama wave. Let us organize and do that together. It could be one of the biggest fillip to reignite CARICOM development and the integration process. Jamaica is open to share. I thank you.
Minister, thank you very much. And I think this, the program mentions, for example, the challenges faced by the OECS, but one also forgets how much that a lot of the difficulties faced, particularly the export side under FTAs, Jamaica has also suffered its fair share. And it also shows, the minister was pointing to all these wonderful initiatives that you don't need an FTA to generate big bangs in terms of exports. Now, the Honourable Minister enjoyed diplomatic immunity from any challenges to the length of his remarks, but I will have to enforce it with a little bit that doesn't apply to the rest of the speaking list. So, Professor Palmer Thomas, please.
Good morning. Thank you very much for giving me the chance to speak to you here. Can I have the... Thanks. I'm going to begin with something which may seem absurdly ridiculous for an audience like this, since you all know the various definitions of the Caribbean, but unfortunately, what image you have of the Caribbean with regard to its performance very much depends on what definition you take. So starting with CARICOM at the first, well, we all know what that is. CARIFORUM, we all know what that is. Then there's the definition which you will find normally if you go to some official secondary source, which is the independent Caribbean states. Then there's a definition which includes all island states, which of course includes many of the non-sovereign parts of the Caribbean. And then you have the definition that I prefer, which is all the islands plus the 3 Guyanas and Belize, which you can build a database for. Indeed, that's what I've done in this book I recently published on the Caribbean, but is not available in any single official source, not one. And yet, in a way, that is a better definition of what the Caribbean is and a better judge, if you like, of its performance. And finally, you have the Association of Caribbean States definition, which, by including the littoral Caribbean, will clearly be dominated by Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, and so on. I'll come back to that at various points, because clearly whatever statistics or images we put up is going to be affected by what definition we use. Fortunately, the minister spares me the... Oh, let me just have this quote first from the West India Commission, because this is, after all, 1992. The deteriorating export performance of CARICOM economies over the past 20 years must be a cause of great concern to the governments and policymakers of the region. And sadly, we now have another 20 years when we shall see a similar deterioration. This is the one that the minister referred to, the shares of world merchandise exports, so I needn't dwell on that. Both CARICOM, the blue line, and the Caribbean, which is defined here as the independent Caribbean states. That's the one which you can extract easily from official secondary sources. But if we go to this one, shares of world merchandise imports, which merchandise imports in the Caribbean are roughly a proxy for exports of goods and services, you get also a rather worrying trend. Interestingly enough, if you break it down by country, there are 3 where the share increased: Trinidad and Tobago, Dominican Republic, and Guyana. But in all other countries, all other independent Caribbean countries, the share declined over that 20-year period, which is a very worrying situation. Again, we've heard from the minister about the share of world service exports, so I can skip that, and indeed of world travel exports. But here's one that he didn't talk about, and probably very few of you have seen. This is one using the database in my book, which refers to all the islands plus the 3 Guyanas and Belize, and it's the ratio of Caribbean total exports, that's goods and services, to GDP from 1960 to the present. And you can see this very dramatic increase The numbers on the horizontal axis for some reason have been squeezed down here. I'm sorry about that. But basically, it's 1960 to 2010, so a 50-year period. You can see that the ratio rises very sharply up to the 70s, implying export-led growth. And then you get this fluctuation with a marked decline in the last few years. And indeed, the ratio is now back to where it was in the 1970s. If we break it down by subgroup, we can see that only Cuba in that crucial period since 2006 was able to raise its ratio of total exports to GDP. Everywhere else, whether it's the Dutch, British, US territories, the Caribbean as a whole, or CARICOM and the French territories, saw a decline. Now that raises an interesting question, which is, well, is it the case that perhaps the Caribbean doesn't export enough in relation to other countries in the world? So I did some econometrics, and I won't bore you with the technical details, but essentially I took all the countries in the world with populations of less than 10 million, it's about just over 100, and took the export to GDP ratio as the dependent variable, and the explanatory variables being population and income per head, which is the standard way in which these things are analyzed. And we find that if we compare the predicted ratio from that econometric work with the actual, we do have some countries where the ratio is higher than would be predicted. Guyana, Puerto Rico, Trinidad, Belize, Barbados. But then you have a long tail where the ratio is indeed below what you might otherwise have expected, implying that as a result of this, if you like, 40 years of underperformance with regard to exports of goods and services, not surprisingly, exports are below what might be predicted in terms of the rest of the world. Let me now just take you back very briefly, because I know Sasha is watching me like a hawk, and ask what I think is a fundamentally important question. And that is the difference in the Caribbean between a paradigm shift and a country shift. When the Europeans first came into the Caribbean in the 16th and 17th century, they destroyed the local economies and effectively carried out a paradigm shift in terms of the export pattern of all the countries. That led to a process of monoculture, which didn't always mean sugar. In the case of Haiti, after independence, it meant coffee, for example. But it did produce this high degree of specialization in individual countries, basically until the great sugar crisis of the 1880s. Then there was what I call a 60-year period of a country shift. This is a 60-year cycle, Minister. The Kondratiev wave, of course, is a 50-year cycle, so these are not the same. This is a country shift where individual countries basically found a solution to their problems by diversifying their commodity exports. And we know examples of that, St. Vincent with arrowroot, Grenada with nutmeg, etc., etc. Hundreds of examples that we could give. But then from around 1950 to, say, to where we are today, there was a paradigm shift where the whole region shifted into service exports, above all tourism. So the question we have to ask ourselves is the next 60-year cycle, if you like, will that be a paradigm or a country shift? Will it be a paradigm shift with all parts of the Caribbean moving into the same sort of thing, or will it be a country shift? Well, I think it's pretty clear from the tone of the conference so far, and indeed from my own personal view, that it will be a country shift, not a paradigm shift. You can't rule out a paradigm shift. For example, it's possible that China might become such an important partner for the Caribbean that it became the main trading partner for all of them, not just for imports, but also for exports, as it has done for South America, and that would represent a paradigm shift for the Caribbean. But it's more likely, I think, to be a country shift, and that means that solutions, to some extent, will be found at the country level rather than the regional level, although there are clearly going to be areas in which countries can and do cooperate. Let me now, sorry, I'm using two different. The obvious basic questions now, this is the sort of 101 of Caribbean economics, if you like, is should it be goods or services? Should it be intra-regional or extra-regional? what should be the choice of core countries, and most important of all, the issue of competitiveness. On the question of goods or services, yes, there will be opportunities in goods. Clearly, if you are a mineral exporter or have the potential for a food surplus exports, and we've heard some examples about this this morning, there will be cases where goods provide, if you like, the escape valve, the country shift. But they will be relatively few, and one should always be skeptical about projecting into the future price trends for commodities, because the whole point about high prices is that they do attract additional supply while restricting demand. And so eventually you would expect those price changes to reverse. But at the moment, you can see good prospects for mineral exporters and good prospects for those handful of countries with potential for agricultural exports. But it's more likely to be in services. And the picture on services is, of course, an interesting one. This, again, using the database for all the islands plus the 3 Guyanas and Belize, has 2 lines. The blue line at the bottom is everything. But the red line excludes Puerto Rico and Trinidad and Tobago, where merchandise exports, from both of which are so important. And you'll see that that ratio got stuck about 20 years ago, interestingly, about the time that the West India Commission reported. So what you have is a ratio for those countries of, a ratio of about 60%, which has remained stuck for a long time, implying that there is indeed a great deal of potential for shifting into service exports. What kind? Well, I think traditional services in the form of tourism, that's going to be tough, particularly for countries other than Cuba. In London, we were fortunate last week to have a very high-level delegation for Cuba talking about their plans for expanding the tourist industry. And I must say, if I'd been a Caribbean national, I think shivers would have gone down my spine, because the numbers they're talking about, even if they don't achieve all of it, are vast and almost by definition imply some diversion of tourists away from the rest of the Caribbean towards Cuba. But as we've heard, there are huge opportunities in non-tourist service exports. I list here some, but it would be very easy to see that in this country shift that I was talking about earlier on, individual countries might start to specialize in some of these things. Not everyone is going to have a film festival, for example. Not everyone is going to excel at sports trainings and facilities, and certainly not everyone will excel at space services in the way that French Guiana does. But nonetheless, the scope for specialization and export-led growth based on these non-tourist services, to me, looks very impressive. Now, secondly, the choice of core countries. This concept of the core has always been crucial in the Caribbean in the last 500 years. And right now, the core is a very reduced number of partners. It's essentially Canada, the United States, and the European Union. That is a very small list. And as we've heard, the long-term prospects for those 3 are not that great. So it does raise the question of what about the potential for new members of the core? That's what I got left?
No, that's where you finished.
So what does that mean? That I've got to stop right now in the mid-sentence? A couple of minutes. Okay, right. I would have thought the potential new members of the core are pretty clear. It's Brazil, China, Mexico, and Russia, with Venezuela as a kind of marginal member of that core. Now, what you have here, if you look along the row, you'll see that CARICOM, 1.1% of its merchandise exports go to Brazil, 1% to China, subtotal 4.2. The only country or group where there's a significant proportion go to these potential new members of the core is Cuba, and that's as a result of its 20% of its merchandise exports going to China. Now, it may be difficult for CARICOM, Hispaniola, Dutch territories, or the Caribbean as a whole to reproduce the relationship that Cuba has with China. I fully accept that. But I think it shows you the extraordinary imbalance that exists between everybody else and what Cuba has been able to do in that respect. In any case, as the ministers told us earlier on, these are the fast-growing economies with long-term potential. And it's not just in merchandise exports. The potential to sell service exports to these countries, especially the neighbors such as Mexico and Brazil, I think is very considerable. Then the final point was interregional versus extra-regional trade. Well, as everybody in this room knows, CARICOM, at least if you exclude Haiti and focus on the CSME countries, maybe 50% of Caribbean countries, but it's only 15% of Caribbean population, 20% of GDP, 25% of Caribbean trade. It remains and will remain a very small part of the Caribbean. And so I've always argued that there is still plenty of scope for widening in the Caribbean. And just as an illustration of that, I show this graph here, which shows the merchandise imports per head in CARICOM, 4,301, compared with, say, the British territories, 5 times higher, the French territories twice as high, and the Dutch and the US territories 3 times as high. Now, even though they have small populations, that means that their total imports are quite large, so that the French territories, for example, have total imports 1/3 of all CARICOM, because they have, or the US territories have total imports which are twice as large as all CARICOM. I just use that to illustrate that there is right here on the doorstep of CARICOM states a huge market about which very little is known, and about which I think the potential is huge. Finally, I finish now on this issue of competitiveness, because it's very easy to forget that if you are super competitive, as Taiwan was and Singapore is, in a sense, you don't need any free trade agreements. You don't need any regional integration. You're just so competitive that people will want to buy your goods. It's a necessary and sufficient condition, if you like, for export-led growth. That's not the case in the Caribbean. And instead, we have all sorts of rough proxies for how competitive Caribbean countries have. Most of them are frankly useless. I think of these competitiveness indexes that you see widely used, the first 4, in my view, are of no use at all to the Caribbean. The 5th, I think, is useful, but it's extremely hard to get the data. And the 6th is probably the best rough proxy that we have. So let's look at the labor productivity for the few countries where we can get it. This is GDP per person engaged with an index of 1990 being 100. Well, we can see that Trinidad and the Dominican Republic score very high on this measure. No great surprises there. Other countries perform rather badly, some very badly. If we then contrast that with the real effective exchange rate, which, as I say, is a sort of rough proxy for competitiveness, we can see that, if you like, Trinidad and Tobago pays the price. Sorry, what have I done? Well, that was the last graph, so it doesn't matter. Trinidad and Tobago pays the price for its extremely good productivity performance by having an appreciating real exchange rate. But in other countries, the change in the real exchange rate was not really enough to compensate for the quite disappointing productivity performance. So this is a huge topic, and I can't go into it here, but you'll never get anywhere talking about EPAs or FTAs or partial scope agreements or anything like that unless your own house is in order, and competitiveness is clearly a very crucial part of that. Thanks.